Welcome to the Archive Room podcast. This is episode 2, first broadcast on Manx Radio on the 25th of August. It's a collection of stories of Manx life in years gone by, told by the people who were there. Fastamai, Judith Lay here, opening the door to the Archive Room. And if you're interested in stories about our island and like meeting great characters, then you're going to love spending the next half hour in the Archive Room. Come on in, sit down and relax. Tonight we're exploring Old Douglas, firstly in the company of a man who was taken to live on Douglas Head Road in 1906 when he was just 6 weeks old, and he remained there for the rest of his life. He is Lewin Kane, in his mid-80s when this recording was made, and we join him walking round Douglas Harbour, telling David Collister about the very different landscape and life that he remembers growing up there in the early 1900s.
Where the bus station is now, that was a series of lanes, hideouts, cottages, and you name it. One story comes to mind of a policeman, Charlie Ford, and the lane in question was called Seneschal Lane, and he was on beat this night and he found a horse dead in the middle of the lane, but seeing as how he couldn't spell Seneschal, he dragged the horse to 4th Street. That's true, that.
Yes.
He was a big man, I knew him well, Charlie, big heavy man.
What did these people do that lived in that area then? Were they mostly working on the quay in this area roundabout?
There was lots of work, but there was no work outside. We'll say once you got up as far as when Hillesley Road was called Siberia, it was called Hillesley Road. From there on, it was mountains. Yeah. Nothing, not a building of any sort on it. The result was all the work was down here. Quiggins was the main dealers, the gas company, the Gellings Foundry moulding shop, Knox's the engineers, all the work was down in this area, those that had work. And those that hadn't, well, they were at the fishing or sailing. I was sailing with my grandfather, and we were trading all over, and I was 8 years of age, all down the Irish coast, all up the border area. Every little harbour that's up there now, I've been in it at some time or other.
What, fishing or other?
No, trading.
Yeah.
Salt, herrings, turnips, potatoes, and bringing back ballast. And the funny thing is, when you were loading ballast at a shilling a ton, you can understand what work was.
That's hard and heavy work, isn't it?
Hard and heavy work for the men. I was only the ship's cat. I was blamed for everything that went on that boat.
Quite an experience for an 8-year-old in the years before the First World War. But we're back on the harbour now, where Lewin and David are discussing pubs, past and present.
2 pubs in front of us there, the Clarendon and the Douglas.
Yes.
There's still quite a lot of pubs along there, but apparently we had a lot more than that, did we?
You had a lot of pubs there, in all, right round the quayside, up as far as the Stone Bridge, and down to the Trafalgar on the South Quay. There were 22 pubs.
That's so?
Yeah, it's true. You started off at the steam packet, the Royal, and then you had 3 together on the corner of Walpole Avenue, the Masonic, the Mansion, Liverpool Arms, and the Oddfellows Arms. The Sheffield was on the corner of 4th Street, and then you moved up the quay here, and you've got the same old pubs here, the Clarendon, the Douglas, the Market, and the Albert. They're all there. And then over in Cambrian Place, where the widows' houses was, you had the Crown, and there was all sorts of dives in there too, where you were never short. Mind you, beer was 6 a pint.
Then as you go along the quay, I mean, still some of those pubs are still there as well, of course, aren't they?
Oh yes, the Bridge and the Saddle,
yeah,
and the Waterloo.
These pubs you're talking about would just be a room or two, just a smoker,
yes.
really, wouldn't they?
Little pubs, but they had their own clients from all walks of life.
But someone else had very different memories of the South Quay and Douglas pubs. Catherine Cowan became a published author at the age of 92 with the release of Alice's story, the story of Alice and Robert, Catherine's parents, a fascinating book that we'll return to next week. But in a conversation that David Collister had with Catherine about the contents of the book, the subject of places of refreshment on Douglas South Quay cropped up.
One of the things you write about is the Coffee Palace on the North Quay in Douglas.
Yes.
After your father died, your mother decided to take this coffee palace.
No, the people who had the coffee palace were asked by
The Temperance Committee.
Temperance people, yes.
Yes, the Temperance Committee, in fact. Yes.
Yes, they were asked by the military to provide their sergeants with a club room in the coffee palace. And the temperance people were delighted with this because they thought that this had been rigged up in the first place to be a good temperance retreat. And it had fallen into disuse. Now this was a chance to make it useful again for the temperance.
The temperance movement.
Movement, yes.
Yeah. But there was a lot of pubs down there, wasn't there?
Oh, it was crammed with squalid little pubs.
Yeah.
Just cheek by jowl was the only way to put it.
You refer to smelly key hobblers in this. What were they then?
Now, the key hobblers were men who frequented the quayside, doing nothing. They were called hobblers because they didn't have shoes. They had bare feet.
Yes.
And they were the key hobblers. They picked up bits of coal from the ships when they were being unloaded. Then they would sell the coal off that had fallen from the carts onto the quayside.
This coffee palace was nothing of a palace then when your mother saw it?
Oh, no. It was dreadful. Oh, it was dreadful.
You were right about vermin running around and so on, don't you?
Oh, yes. Oh, it stank.
So she must have been quite a tough woman to take it on, in fact.
Well, she needed the money. She was horrified by it, absolutely horrified. But...
She made a go of it, though, didn't she?
Oh, yes. She had a very good way of delegating jobs to the right people, and this stood her in very good stead.
Do you ever remember having coffee in the coffee palace?
Oh, no. I must tell you, it was called the Coffee Palace. Nobody drank coffee in the island in those days. Coffee was strange. It was all tea. Great tea urns, enormous tea urns filled with hot water, kept being topped up with hot water, but no coffee.
You refer to yourself in the book as Kiri then, don't you?
Yes.
Was that a sort of nickname then?
No. When I was born in a snowstorm, and my father, first time he saw me, he said, Kiri Fanyachta, which is sheep in the snow.
Yes.
And I was always called Kiri.
Oh, really?
Yes, I still am by my nieces. No longer auntie, just Kiri.
Catherine Cowan, who was 92 at the time of that conversation, and that little story about Catherine's family nickname leads us nicely back into more stories from Llewyn Cain, still on Douglas Harbour with David Collister, talking about local characters and how they got their nicknames.
They all had nicknames, like Johnny Fulginny, he was one, an awful character. There was Ned Oxy, he was the Ragabone man. You could hear him calling Aragbone, Aragbone, rabbit skins, bottles and jars, that was his call.
Yeah.
And then there was Johnny Putty, who was selling papers.
I remember Johnny.
Well, he would sound, paper, big boat in the bay, and you would say, what boat is it, Johnny? Buy the paper and find out. That was his call.
Yeah.
And, of course, there was Kelly the Knife Grinder. There was Pegleg Cayley.
Now, Pegleg Cayley, that's an intriguing name.
Well, he had just a stump for his right leg. A round stump. No foot on it or nothing, just a stump. Yeah. But he was the most powerful coal trimmer I think I've ever seen. And I watched him trimming coal in Knowles's coal yard, which is where the steam packet engine shop is now. And where other men would take 3 trims to get the coal to the top, he could throw the coal up there in one go. Yes. But there was always a pint bottle of ale standing alongside of him on the ground. One can't imagine, unless you've got photographs of the bus station as it was in those days, you would be lost in it.
Yes. But what was the quality of life like for these people then?
Poor. Those that hadn't any money or hadn't any work, there was only the soup kitchen. There was no dole as we know it today, no public relief, just the soup kitchen. and Watticott's grounds.
Well, we've come down now to the bus depot end of the quay here, and this then, Lewin, is where there used to be open markets.
Yes, the concrete where these cars are standing now, the first row near the quay, was open market, and the stalls were there, and there was every type of stall you could imagine. The fish were lying on the concrete, and the big cods that were coming in those days, big jack cods, and on a Saturday night, nobody wanted them. There was no electric, no fridges. You could buy a jack cod, big one, for a tenner. That's the truth. But the rest were oyster stalls. You'd see people standing by, and the oysters would be opened up, pepper and salt put on them, and vinegar, and gone, disappeared. Yeah. There was Mrs. Lindsay, Jimmy Lindsay's mother. She had the weighing machine, and you got weighed and also got a packet of little sweets for your penny or whatever it cost you on the scales.
Was it a busy market then?
Oh, very busy.
I believe one or two people kept a cow or two in the town as well.
Well, nearly all your milk was kept in the town. Big Well Street. I remember Watterson's having cows in Big Well Street. Albert Watson had cows in Drinkwater Street. And as far up as Westview, Neen's had cows kept in the back of Westview.
Yeah.
And everywhere you went, you could get milk, and that's the only way you got it.
You had to go and collect your milk then?
Collect your milk, unless you were lucky enough to find a farmer who had a cart with a churn on it. And he would turn the tap on and give you a pint, whatever you wanted.
Right. Now, what about grocery stores then? I mean, were there plenty of those?
Groceries were everywhere.
Yeah.
Even down on the South Quay by the swing bridge. Gussie Crane, who later became a mayor of this town, had a grocery shop on the other side of the quay, right alongside of Woodhouse Terrace.
So you could get anything and everything provided you had the money for it?
Provided you had the money, you could get what you wanted. The characters I've known and met in this town, it's a job to remember them all.
Tell me about some of them, because you've had a narrow shave or two with some of them, haven't you?
Yes. Well, if you can imagine Shaw's Brow, back of Athol Street, and down through what we call Little Hell, that came right down onto Barrack Street.
Little Hell?
Little Hell. It was a dive where you wouldn't dare come down at night time. But I remember one time, and it was about 1924, and I was sent down by my boss to repair a sink in a house in Little Hell. In this room there was a round table, 3 legs on it, and 2 occupants sitting on boxes, and they were drinking methylated spirits. Well, I got on with my job, but I heard the knife grinder machine coming down the steps. From Athol Street there were 3 sets of 2 steps, and then a stop. And then there were 6 steps and a flat. And it stops at the 6 steps. And the gentleman came in through the door, and he saw the lady and the other fellow drinking methylated spirits, and he shouted, "Is my so-and-so dinner ready?" And she said, "No." "Well, I'm going to the Wheatsheaf for a pint," he said, "and when I come back, if it's not on that table, I'll cut your throat." "And yours," he said to me. I never got out of the house so quick in my life. Left the gear and everything else belonging to it. And I know those 2 parties. Scale Auckland was one of them.
Yes.
And the other was a widow of ill repute.
So this was an area then that you'd call a no-go area, was it?
It was a no-go area, as they were all people that hadn't virtually nothing.
So you'd get mugged, would you, or what?
Oh, you'd be mugged, and nobody'd know what happened to you. And the amazing thing is, it was almost next door to the police station.
So the police were still patrolling just the same?
Oh, yes, but police wouldn't go down to Little Hell at night either. You didn't know what was going to happen to you down there. You could be ditched, you could be dropped into a boat, and good night, Josephine.
You're not telling me people were being murdered down there, then?
Well, there was a murder, but it was in the back of Timmel Street. I remember that very well indeed, and one of the occupants I've just been speaking about had been involved in that. And I remember as a boy going up and seeing the blood-stained hand mark on the door of this garden at the back of Timmel Street where the lady was murdered.
Yeah.
Her name was Mrs. Quayle.
How long ago was that then?
It's about 1918 or 19 as far as I can remember.
Yes.
But it happened on a Sunday night. She was up feeding her hens, and she was murdered.
Was the murderer discovered, was it?
They had suspicions, right? I can't remember him ever being got by the police and taken into custody.
Well, it's called Shaw's Brow today, but you called it the Brew, did you?
Shaw's Brew, we called it, and there was a court in there, Athol Court, and nearly all the people that lived in Shaw's Brow, both in Athol Court and the downside part of Shaw's Brow, worked in Quiggins, either in the timber yard or in the rope works or in the railway.
Now, there were one or two organ grinders and battle organ people as well, weren't there?
Yes, there was Flario, and he is of Italian origin. That man used to go about playing with an organ with a leg on it. The leg used to drop down to take the weight of the organ, and he'd be turning it with his hand.
Yes, like a hurdy-gurdy.
Like a hurdy-gurdy. All round the town you could hear Flario.
Yes.
And of course there were 2 or 3 blind people with concertinas. There were no shortage of music all around the town. Battle organs, concertinas, accordions.
So they made a living at this, did they?
Yes, the people put money in their pocket or their hat thrown on the floor. Now, in Woodhouse Terrace down on the quay, you had about 8 families living in there. They all staffed the Fort Anne Hotel, in the kitchens, in the dining room, in the bedrooms. But having said that, the men folk worked either in the foundries or in the coal boats.
Yeah.
There was the Cowans and the Turtons and the Neils and the Cavannahs. But in one family of Neils, they were all redheads.
Yes.
And each one in turn had a different name. There was Ginger, there was Rusty, and there was Copper. Those are the names to define each boy. That carried on for a long time.
Did you have a nickname yourself?
No. Just Lewin.
Yes.
Aye.
Lewin Kane sharing stories about life on Douglas North and South Keys in the early 1900s. Alfie Gilmore, who was born in 1915, grew up in rural Spring Valley, living on a country lane that led through the nunnery grounds and out towards Lee Terrace. Alfie and his 3 brothers went to Coueg School, and his childhood memories will feature in a future programme. But now we're going to hear a little about his early working life, first as an apprentice at Todhunter and Elliott.
And those days, of course, as an apprentice, you just said, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full. You had to be obedient and pay attention to what was going on. And as a matter of fact, you may not think so now, but I was rather a timid type because I was thrown in the deep end. I hadn't any experience like other fellas, like other lads, read in town. I was read in the country, shy type. And of course, you go to work many a time, and if you had your hat on, you took your hat off before you got to the house to pay respect. So wipe your feet with it many a time before you went in. This was discipline, you see. And big Jimmy Taggart and I, one day, we went to a house, Tremissery Lodge, at the bottom of Blackberry Lane, to do something or other in the kitchen, probably a burst water pipe. And the lady answered the door, of course, very nice person. And she said, oh, come in. She said, I'm glad to see you, this, that and the other. And she said, this is a parrot, he said, and we'd like to sit this parrot in the sun, on this table because there's a nice sunshine coming through the window. And by the way, gentlemen, she said, this parrot doesn't have anything to do with swear words. This is a house where there's no swearing. We're good living types here. Oh, well, that's all right, said Big Jimmy. As far as we're concerned, there'll be no swearing from us. And she looked at me, and I just nodded my head in agreement, you see. So after a while, Jimmy Taggart had been down to the parrot at the cage, saying something to him. I didn't know what on earth he was saying to it. Well, after an hour or so, the lady come in to see did we want a cup of tea or that, which was a good thing those days if you got a cup of tea on the job. And when she come in, she says to Jimmy Taggart, how are you going on? And the parrot immediately says, you're a stupid bugger. And the lady in the house whipped round and looked at the parrot straight away, and she said, what did you say? And the parrot said, you're a stupid bugger. Well, of course, I was nearly fainting myself because I never even looked at the parrot.
No.
I know now that it was Jimmy Taggart that
That's what he'd been saying.
He'd been saying to the parrot, "I'm quiet, you're a stupid bugger."
Well, you'd both be in trouble with you.
Oh, right, yes. She said, "I've good mind." She said, "Oh, dear, out of the house." "Oh, no," he says, "you can't do that." He says, big Jimmy Taggart says, "I'm awfully sorry. It must have been the young fella. I'll chastise him when we go off the job." Well, I was shivering, mate.
Blaming you.
They're blaming me. It must have been the young fella, he says. I wouldn't say boo to a goose now mind the blue and parrots. She said she complained to Mr. Harvey and Mr. Kennick and Mr. Quilliam, who were the three directors. Whether she did or not, I've forgotten. But of course, on the way out, you know, Jimmy Taggart had one or two other words to say to the parrot before we left. Well, whether it was stronger language or not, I don't know, but we never worked on that. That was the second time. When we got to the bottom of Summer Hill, you know, to get the horse car back along the promenade, that was transport those days. That was your transport those days. When we got to the bottom of Summer Hill, big Jimmy Taggart says, "Well, did you enjoy the joke, Alfie?" And I said, "What joke, Mr. Taggart?" Had to be Mr. Taggart,
Yeah.
he was a senior. I said, "What joke?" Well, he says, "Did you enjoy the parrot swearing?" I said, "Well, I didn't really, because I got the blame." Well, he says, "Somebody had to get the blame." He said, "You learn," he said, "you learn, boy, you learn." Well, I took the blame.
Apprentice Alfie Gilmore learning life's lessons the hard way. But he too can recall some colourful characters from his younger days.
There were good characters around the town and villages those days. I was still living at Spring Valley, of course. I wasn't married. I was still in Toddlington as an apprentice. But I always remember a builder's labourer by the name of Bob Bell. He was a mason's labourer. And he was called Buster Drum. Buster Drum, he was called, and I thought, well, why Buster Drum, you see? And of course the lads told me, and this is quite true, that Bob Bell at one time, he'd been in the Salvation Army, and he was fond of going on the booze every now and again. Of course, when he went on the booze, he was drummed out of the Salvation Army. Then, of course, he'd made a promise, and he'd sign the pledge, and he'd rejoin the Salvation Army. Right, well, this particular night, he was on the promenade, and he was spouting the odds how good the Salvation Army were. And mind you, the Salvation Army are good, there's no doubt about that, but a good organisation they are. And how sorry he was that he'd made a fool of himself by going on the Yale, and they brought him back into their fold, and he was quite happy. Happy, he says, "I'm so happy," he said, "I could bust this ruddy drum." And he did. He jumped on the drum with joy, and he was drummed out again for good. He was drummed out for good. Buster Drum, he was called ever after. Yes. And also, of course, there were other characters around the town too. There was Ben Cooley, I may have told you, there was Ben Cooley, there was Rockamoldy, there was Fat Jack, he was a nice old boy, he was Fat Jack, of course, and Scare Lachlan. And of course, we knew all these characters, and Bella Dole, and they all slept out. They were tramps, but they were quite harmless. Quite harmless. They used to live or sleep up at the Three Hedges at Pulrose. Up there they slept. They used to take galvanised sheets off the tip. The tip was going those days before Pulrose houses were built, just getting built. And they slept up there, but they were quite harmless.
Thank you, Alfie Gilmore, Catherine Cowan and Lewin Kane. And of course, sincere thanks to the late David Collister, without whose hard work all these wonderful stories might otherwise have been lost. And my personal thanks to Manx Radio's archivist, Tim Price, who's selecting the topics for this series. In the archive room next week, we'll be staying in Old Douglas. Alfie Gilmore has a career change, but the adventures seem to follow him. Tennis comes to Douglas in a big way, and we get a taste of holiday making on Douglas Head. That's in the archive room just after 6 next Thursday evening, or listen at your leisure to the podcasts. Go to manxradio.com and search for The Vault. There you'll find all available episodes of the archive room and lots more from the Manx Radio Store of Nostalgia. But as we close the archive room door for this week, this is Judith saying thank you for listening and stay with us. It's Mike Reynolds' Greatest Hits next here on Your Manx Radio. And the last word is a vintage sign-off. But can you put a name to this voice?
Anyway, till next week, so long, Nissa.
The Nation Station.